They engineered the perfect soldier. They forgot we were already one. The serum was the size of a breath mint. That was the part Captain Mara Voss never quite got over. That something so small could rewrite everything she thought she knew about the human body, about war, about the galaxy itself. That something designed in a sterile Cathari laboratory, carried across 40 light years in a refrigerated diplomatic case, could fall into a human stomach by accident and break the universe open like an egg. But that came later. First came the tribunal. The Galactic Accord Tribunal convened on the neutral station of Ethara Prime every standard cycle, and it was by almost universal agreement the most boring place in the known galaxy. 17 species, 243 delegates, one enormous debating chamber carved from a dead neutron star's cooling shell, and absolutely nothing of consequence had been decided here in 400 years. The Cathari had proposed it. The Tethari had agreed. The Vrendi had abstained because the Vrendi abstained from everything on principle. Humanity had been given 3 seats at the far left of the chamber, near the atmospheric processors, which the other delegates considered politely appropriate placement given the species' tendency to emit unusual biochemical compounds during stress. That was the word they used. Unusual. Mara Voss had been the human military liaison to Vethara Prime for 7 months. She had a desk, a small quarters module, a view of the station's hydroponics bay, and a sidearm she was technically not permitted to carry inside the chamber. She carried it anyway, not because she expected trouble, she expected profound, soul-grinding boredom, but because 7 months among 17 alien species had taught her that the universe had a sense of humor and she preferred to be armed when it started laughing. She was 34 years old, former pilot, former infantry, former 6 things the Accord didn't have clearance labels for. She had one reconstructed shoulder, a scar that ran from her left temple to the corner of her mouth that she'd stopped explaining to people, and hair she kept cropped close because in 0G it became a navigational hazard. Her commanding officer had described her, in an official report, as possessed of unusual initiative. The Cathari diplomatic handler, a 7-foot being of iridescent chitin and liquid slow movements, had described her as the small aggressive one who smells of adrenaline. Both were accurate. She had arrived at Vethara Prime expecting a posting that would test her patience. She had been right about that. What she hadn't expected was that it would also test every assumption she had ever built about what humans were and what the galaxy was prepared to let them become. Those things had a way of arriving without announcement, usually at the worst possible moment, in the worst possible form, which, in her experience, was the universe's default operating mode. The station itself was a wonder she had mostly stopped noticing, which was its own kind of admission. Vethara Prime had been constructed over 300 years by the combined architectural traditions of 11 species, each contributing structural philosophies that were, in the most fundamental sense, incompatible. A Cathari corridor flowed into a Tessari junction at angles that human geometry had no name for. The lighting calibration shifted every 40 meters to accommodate the visual spectrum of a different species. The atmospheric zones were layered so precisely that you could walk 12 steps down a corridor and go from standard human comfortable to a pressure and composition that would kill you in under a minute if you weren't paying attention. Mara was always paying attention. That was the thing about humans that the other species found simultaneously impressive and exhausting. They couldn't turn it off. 7 months on a station designed by and for 17 different biologies, and she could now navigate it in complete darkness by atmospheric pressure alone. The slight shift in humidity that marked the Teshari section, the mineral taste in the recycled air that meant she was close to the Vrendi habitat modules, the specific frequency of the ventilation signals near the Cathari delegate quarters that ran 2 cycles faster than everywhere else. Because Cathari biology required more precise oxygen mixing. She hadn't tried to learn any of it. She had simply been present long enough that her body had decided to know it. Her opposite number in today's proceedings was Delegate Coordinator John Sett of the Cathari, who occupied a hovering metabolic cradle that maintained the precise atmospheric pressure his biology required, and who had spent the last 4 months making Mara's professional life into something she could only describe as structured humiliation. The Cathari were the oldest spacefaring civilization in the Accord. They moved through galactic politics the way a deep ocean current moves, slowly, in every direction at once, with an absolute certainty that the surface disturbances of newer species were temporary and ignorable. They had been old when humanity was learning fire. They found humans charming the way a mountain finds a cloud charming. Briefly there, briefly interesting, fundamentally irrelevant. John said in particular had a habit of referencing, in the most clinically neutral tone possible, the human species' limited psychological stability, its biological susceptibility to emotional flooding, its statistically significant rate of self-destructive behavior. He did this not with malice. The Cathari didn't really do malice, but with something worse. Patient, absolute certainty that he was correct. He was 420 years old. He had watched 11 species cycle through the Accord's edge mission process, reach for relevance, and gradually find their administrative level. He had seen it done so many times that the pattern had become for him as natural as gravity, inevitable, baked into the structure of things. Mara understood that. She didn't forgive it. John said in particular had said 3 weeks ago, in a subcommittee meeting on frontier patrol distribution, the human delegation offers predictable tactical aggression without strategic sophistication. We do not doubt their willingness to die for territory. We question their capacity to understand why territory matters. Mara had written 8 different responses in her head. She had delivered none of them. That was her job. Sit, listen, absorb, represent. She was very tired of her job. The morning the serum changed, everything started like all the others, badly. The Vrendi filed a procedural objection to the chamber lighting. The Tessari counter-filed about the Vrendi's objection. The human delegation, Mara plus 2 civilian diplomats named Horik and Chen, who she genuinely liked and genuinely wished, were not here for what was about to happen, settled into their seats near the atmospheric processors, and waited for nothing to happen at a speed that felt almost intentional. The agenda item was a Cathari proposal, the Frontier Pacification Protocol, a politely worded plan to reassign patrol responsibilities for the galactic edge sectors away from human ships, too aggressive, too unpredictable, too likely to misinterpret signals from as yet uncontacted species, and toward Cathari vessels, which were better calibrated for extended patience operations. The language was precise, clinical. Every phrase had been chosen to be unobjectionable. You could read the whole document 3 times and not find a single sentence you could legally argue against. Delegate Chen caught Mara's eye. She read his expression, "This is it, they're doing it," because this wasn't really about patrol sectors. This was about the 12 human warships currently stationed at the galactic edge. This was about removing humanity's military presence from the frontier entirely. This was the Cathari playing their 17,000-year-old game, sliding pieces across a board that humans had only just realized they were sitting on. Mara had spent 3 nights with Chen going through Accord records, pulling every historical precedent they could find. The pattern, once you saw it, was impossible to unsee. 11 times in the last 400 years, always younger species, always framed as administrative optimization, always resulting in the same slow, measured, irreversible diminishment. John Set spoke for 40 minutes. His translation module rendered everything into a precise, reasonable, unobjectionable argument. The chamber's atmospheric processors hummed. The Vrendi abstained. The Tessari shifted in their crystalline seating structures. The other species watched with the carefully neutral expressions of people who had already decided which way they were going to vote and were waiting, politely, for the speeches to end. Then the accident happened. Not the accident of history, not yet. The small, ordinary, galaxy-tilting accident of a Cathari junior aide tripping over a floor conduit on her way to deliver a delegate's refreshment capsule. The capsule hit the table. It cracked. The contents, a small pressurized bead of liquid the color of deep water, rolled across the polished surface and stopped in front of Mara Voss's sealed water container, which Chen had helpfully already opened for her, and which was close enough in color and scale that when Mara reached without looking, because she was listening to the translation, because she was watching Johnset's crystalline manipulator limbs move in the precise pattern that meant he was about to request a formal vote. Her fingers closed around the bead instead of her canteen. She looked at it. It looked back, as objects do when they are about to change someone's life. "Lieutenant Voss," Chen said quietly, "that's not." She had already swallowed it. For about 8 seconds, nothing happened. Mara set her canteen back down. The chamber continued its proceedings. John Set reached the 3rd rhetorical phase of his prepared remarks, which was the phase where he invited the chamber to consider the historical record of human patrol incidents. Not aggressively, just factually, just the numbers which told their own story. The atmospheric processors hummed. Horak was making notes on his datapad. Then Mara's heart rate, which her implanted biometric monitor logged at 72 beats per minute, went to 95. Then 130, then 180, then 240. Then a number the monitor flagged as outside its operational parameters, followed by a series of alerts she had never seen before, which her body was apparently generating faster than the monitor's alarm system could categorize them. The second sign was heat. Not fever, not gradual warmth, heat, like standing 6 inches from an open furnace, radiating from somewhere below her sternum and spreading outward along every nerve pathway simultaneously. Her skin went hot enough that the Teshari delegate 3 seats down rotated their heat perception organs toward her, with an expression that in their species denoted something roughly translating as "Are you on fire?" "I'm fine," Mara said. She was absolutely not fine. She stood up, because sitting felt suddenly intolerable, because every nerve in her body had decided simultaneously to file a complaint. She knocked over her actual water canteen. Johnset paused his address to observe her with the polite puzzlement of a species that had never understood why humans moved when they were distressed. Then the pain hit. Not quite pain, something closer to the feeling of bones deciding to renegotiate their contract with muscle, of the entire architecture of her body examining its own blueprints, and finding them simultaneously correct and insufficient. She pressed one hand flat on the table and breathed through it. "Breathe. Don't fall. Whatever this is, don't fall. Captain Voss." That was Horak, on his feet now, hand on her arm. His voice had the particular quality of a person trying to be calm at volume. "I'm standing," she said. "Sit down." She did not sit down. She stood, breathing, while the Cathari scientists in the gallery realized what had happened and began their concern. Vibration, a sound like tuning forks, high and anxious, while the chamber erupted in low, translating noise from 17 species all processing the same unusual event. While Johnset's manipulator limbs went still in the Cathari equivalent of shock. She stood until the wave passed. It took about 90 seconds. On the other side of it she felt strange, not sick, not broken. Strange the way a newly recalibrated instrument feels strange. Everything running, everything responding, but to different tolerances than before. Her heart rate had not come down. It had settled at something her monitor described as dangerously elevated, but her body was describing as absolutely fine, actually, possibly preferable. She looked at Johnset across the polished table and said calmly and clearly, "I'd like to table the vote, for medical reasons." The chamber went very quiet, not the committee quiet of procedural pause, the different kind of quiet that happens when something has occurred that nobody has a protocol for. "Seconded," Chen said immediately, his voice perfectly level. The vote was tabled. The session was suspended. The Cathari medical team arrived in 4 minutes, which was fast enough that Mara suspected they'd already been on their way. She walked to the medical bay under her own power, which was the detail that the Cathari scientists discussed among themselves for the rest of the afternoon in tones her translator described as extreme professional concern. She should not have been able to walk under her own power. The concentration of Epsilon-7 in a Cathari subject's bloodstream at the 30-second mark typically produced complete motor function disruption. The fact that she was walking, briskly, she would note, because the strange new calibration of her body wanted to be in motion, was either a miracle or a warning, and the Cathari scientists were not yet sure which. The medical bay diagnosis took 6 hours. The full report took 3 days. Mara spent those 3 days in observation, which she experienced as imprisonment, which was its own specific kind of torture. The suite they gave her was comfortable by Accord standards, which meant it had been designed for a species that was not human and had been approximately adapted to human dimensions, giving it the particular quality of a hotel room that someone has told you is very nice while you are unable to shake the feeling that the proportions are wrong. The bed was slightly too long. The chair was slightly too wide. The window looked out on a maintenance corridor. She did push-ups. She ran in place. She sat still and listened to her body talk to itself, which it was doing in a language she was only beginning to recognize. The electrical hum had started on the second day, low and steady, a current running from fingertips to forearms that her implant couldn't identify and her instruments couldn't classify. When she pressed her hand flat on the wall, she could feel the station's systems through it. The vibration patterns of the atmospheric processors, the pulse of the power grid, the slight irregular thrum that meant one of the secondary ventilation arrays was running half a cycle behind schedule. She did not tell the Cathari medical team about that part. Dr. Vethsan, the lead physician, a young Cathari by species standards, perhaps 200 years old, with the iridescent coloring of someone who had not yet settled into the deep blue authority of age, sat across from her on the morning of the third day and held his manipulators very still, which she had learned was what Cathari did when they had news they hadn't decided how to frame. "The serum," Vethsan said. "It did not fail in your system, it adapted." Mara waited. "Your cellular repair mechanisms are, our instruments are, we calibrated them for known biology." He paused, and in the pause she could hear the genuine scientific bewilderment that his professional composure was containing. "Captain Voss, your cells are not repairing at an accelerated rate. They are doing something our instruments do not have a word for. They are. We keep translating it as learning." She looked at the ceiling of the medical bay. It was curved, smooth, designed to be calming. It was not calming. "Learning," she repeated. "Your immune system has treated the serum as an environmental challenge rather than a chemical compound. It has generated new cellular architecture in response. We have not seen this in any biology we have studied. The rate of adaptation is..." Vethsan's translation module hesitated. "We do not have a good word. Impossible is the closest equivalent, but that is clearly incorrect since we are observing it." Mara sat with that for a moment. "What does that mean? In practical terms, your nerve conduction has increased by a factor of 3. Your injury recovery rate, we tested with a minor surface wound, was complete in under 4 minutes. Your sensory processing appears to have reorganized itself in ways we are still mapping. Your physical output," he paused. "We asked you to press against a load-bearing test frame at moderate effort. You bent it. We are still calculating what moderate effort means for your species at current baselines." Another pause, longer. "And you should know that Delegate John Sett has requested a full quarantine report and a review of your diplomatic status. He has described the incident as a contamination event." Mara's jaw tightened. "Of course he has." She was released from medical observation on the 4th day and immediately found 3 things waiting for her. A message from Earth Command marked urgent, a sealed file from the Cathari Diplomatic Division marked classified, and Ensign Don Park, her communications officer, leaning against the corridor wall with an expression that meant trouble had arrived while she was gone and made itself comfortable. Park was 26, possessed of a calm so absolute it sometimes made her wonder if he was processing events on a slight delay. He was also, she had long suspected, significantly smarter than he let on, which was a quality she appreciated enormously in people who worked for her. "The classified file is a legal motion," he said. "The Cathari are requesting suspension of your diplomatic credentials pending a species capability review. They're arguing that you represent an unpredicted biological variable that has yet to be assessed for accord-compatible risk thresholds. They want to sideline me. They want to sideline you and use the review as grounds to push through the frontier pacification vote while you're under suspension. Timing's deliberate. Harak thinks they've been waiting for any excuse." Mara opened the message from Earth Command. "Admiral Vasquez, 2 light hours away, text only for speed, 3 lines." She read it, closed it. "The Admiral's message?" Park asked. "Hold the line," Mara said. "That's the whole message. Hold the line and don't start a war." "Can you do both?" She looked at her hands. At the slight electrical hum running through her fingertips, steady and low, like a frequency her body had discovered and decided to keep. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. The session reconvened 5 days after the accident. Mara had spent those 5 days doing 3 things simultaneously: working with Vethsan to understand exactly what had changed in her biology, preparing her counter-arguments to the frontier pacification vote with Chen and Horak, pulling every historical accord record they could find, and quietly, in the pre-dawn cycle when the station's lights dimmed to simulate night, testing what she'd become. The tests were not dramatic. She didn't punch through walls or lift cargo containers. She sat alone in the station's small observation deck with the star field spread in every direction, and she felt her body talking to itself in a new language, the serum threading through her system like a new kind of thought. Her reaction time was almost frightening. A tool she dropped never hit the floor. Her wound from the biopsy, which Vethsan said should take 14 days to heal, was gone in 48 hours without a scar. When she was very still, she could hear the atmospheric processors cycling in a room she was not in, could track the slight change in pressure that meant a door 3 corridors away had opened, could feel, through the hull of the station itself, the distant electromagnetic signature of the 12 human warships at the frontier edge. their drives at minimum idle, waiting. She was also still entirely herself. Same dry sense of humor, same habit of humming tunelessly when she was thinking. Same anger at the injustice of things that she kept locked behind her sternum where it was useful, instead of leaking out where it was not. The serum hadn't replaced her. It had amplified her, the way a lens focuses light, taking what was already there and making it denser, sharper, more precisely aimed. Johnset was not expecting that. None of them were. They were expecting fear, or erratic behavior, or the kind of aggressive posturing that the Accord records attributed to humans under biological stress. They were not expecting her to walk into the reconvened session in her formal liaison uniform, sit down at the human delegation's table near the atmospheric processors, and request the floor. She spoke for 12 minutes, not 40, like John said. Not the long tidal arguments of a species that measured time in geological epochs. 12 minutes, because she had learned from 7 months of sitting in this chamber that attention was finite and precision was more honest than volume. She had the Accord's founding charter displayed on the chamber's central screen. She had 300 years of Frontier Patrol incident reports sorted by cause, outcome, and species attribution. She had documentation showing that in every instance where the Cathari had recommended removing a species from Frontier Patrol responsibilities, that species representation across all Accord institutions had declined by an average of 67% within the next 2 standard cycles. This isn't about patrol sectors, she said. She said it plainly, without theatrics, the way she would have addressed a squad before a mission. The Cathari proposal removes human military presence from the frontier, depresses our standing in 5 subcommittees that govern resource allocation, and creates a precedent for species-level administrative restriction that has been used 11 times in this Accord's history, always against species younger than 400 years in the Accord. We recognize the pattern. We're naming it. The chamber was very quiet. She looked at Johnset. He was very still. I also want to address the species capability review. She folded her hands on the table. I will submit to any biological assessment the Accord's medical committee requires. I'll be transparent about what the serum did and what my current capabilities are. I have nothing to hide. A pause. But I want it on record that the Cathari serum, designed to improve a Cathari body's performance, produced a different result in a human body, not because human biology is defective or unstable. It produced a different result because human biology adapted, because that is what human biology does. We've been doing it for 4 million years. It is not a threat. It is the species. And before this Accord decides that human adaptability makes us an administrative inconvenience, I'd like to suggest that it might also make us extraordinarily useful allies. She sat down. Park, behind her, made a small sound she recognized as the sound of a person trying not to react visibly. The vote on the Frontier Pacification Protocol failed, 7-9, with the Vrendi abstaining as predicted and 2 Teshari delegates breaking from the expected coalition. Horak said afterward that he had never seen Teshari delegates break from the Cathari in 4 years of Accord sessions. Chen sat down in his chair and pressed both palms to his face and breathed through his nose for 45 seconds. Johnset requested a private meeting with Mara 3 hours later. She accepted. They met in a small room off the main corridor. Just the 2 of them. No translating staff, just the automated language modules they both wore. Johnset settled his metabolic cradle and regarded her for a long moment in the particular Cathari way, which was not precisely looking but was something more comprehensive, a kind of total registration that she had come to think of as being read. You were not frightened, he said finally. I was, she said. I just didn't let it run the room. The serum changed you. Some things about me changed. Some things didn't. She met his registration steadily. I still have the same interests as I did before. I still want humanity to have a secure, respected presence in this Accord. I still think the frontier sectors are better served by a mixed patrol presence than a monospecies one. And I still think, she added quietly, that the Cathari have been making decisions about our future without asking us. And that needs to stop. Johnset processed this for what felt like a long time. You are not what we expected, he said. No, Mara agreed. We rarely are. It should have ended there. That would have been a reasonable place for it to end. The vote failed. Humanity held its ground. The diplomatic machinery creaked on. But the galaxy, in Mara's experience, did not believe in reasonable endings. The message arrived 8 days later, not through official channels, directly to her personal implant, encrypted in a compression method she didn't recognize. And when her station's intelligence officer cracked it open, the contents were a set of coordinates, a timestamp, and 2 words in clean, unaccented English. They know. It was signed with a geometric symbol that returned 0 database results, as if someone had drawn a door into empty air. Park caught the second part, the ghost data embedded in the message's compression layer, a partial record, Cathari origin codes, deep archive dating, a research project designation, Epsilon series, subjects 1 through 247, a status column. Every entry in the status column read the same word, terminated. Mara sat with that file for a long time, 247 subjects. She went back to the beginning, looking for subject designations, looking for species designations, looking for anything that told her what the Epsilon series had actually been. The data was heavily redacted, deep archive obfuscated, but enough remained. Enough to show that all 247 subjects had been non-Cathari. Enough to show that the subjects had been from 6 different younger species. Enough to show that the test had been running, in various iterations, for 90 years. And enough to show that she was not, by any means, the first human in the series. She went to the coordinates alone, not because she thought it was safe. She thought it was approximately as far from safe as it was possible to be. She went alone because she didn't want to put Park or Horak or Chen in the crosshairs of whatever this was until she understood what this was. She left a sealed file with Park. If she wasn't back in 12 hours, open it. Transmit everything to Earth Command and to every independent news syndicate in the Accord. The coordinates led to Vithara Prime's secondary cargo processing ring, vast, echoing, lit by the orange security glow of automated systems, smelling of recycled atmosphere and machine oil. She walked through stacks of shipping modules for 6 minutes before she heard movement. The person who stepped out from between 2 cargo stacks was human, a woman maybe 40, with the particular stillness of someone who had spent a long time learning not to be noticed. She wore station workers' clothing, worn and genuine. Her right arm was cybernetic below the elbow, good work, military grade, the kind that cost more than a station worker earned in a decade. She moved with the same quality Mara had been developing for the past 8 days, aware of everything in the room without appearing to look at any of it. "Captain Voss," she said. "My name is Lieutenant Commander Rhea Sohn, retired. I was the second human to ingest Cathari research serum 7 years ago. Frontier Station Keller 9. Mara stared at her. "The status column," Mara said. "Terminated means the program was closed," Rhea said, not always the subject. Her voice was level, but something beneath it had edges that had been honed over years. Sometimes the subject. "I lost 4 people I knew when the Cathari decided the experiment had produced unpredictable data and needed to be simplified." The cargo bay hummed around them. "Why contact me now? Because you survived the ingestion and you're still here and you spoke in session instead of going quiet." Rhea's jaw tightened slightly. "The others who survived, there are 6 of us. We've found each other over years. We went quiet. Removed ourselves. It seemed safer. It wasn't. In the end, it never is." She looked at Mara steadily. "You didn't go quiet." "No. John Sett's request for the species capability review is not a medical procedure. We've seen it before. It's the precursor to a reclassification motion. They will argue that the serum-modified humans represent an unregulated species upgrade event, which under Accord statute gives them grounds to petition for reclassification of all human Accord participation to developing non-standard species, which is the Accord's legal category for a species that has forfeited full member rights. The temperature in the cargo bay seemed to drop. "They would use a serum that fell out of a case by accident," Mara said slowly, "as grounds to strip humanity of its Accord membership. They would use it as grounds to begin the process, slowly, legally, with 17 species nodding along because the Cathari have been managing this Accord for 400 years and everyone is very used to nodding." Rhea's mechanical hand opened and closed once. "They are very good at managing things slowly. They've done it 11 times. Mara thought of the records Chen had pulled, the 67% average decline. "What do you need from me? I need you to stay visible. And I need you to understand what you are now. Not because it makes you dangerous. It doesn't. Not more than any human. But because they're afraid of it and frightened opponents make mistakes. And we need them to make mistakes." A pause. "Are you in a room that matters?" "I am," Mara said. "And so are the 12 warships at the frontier edge." Rhea was quiet for a moment. "Then we have a chance." The species capability review was scheduled for the following standard month. In the time between, Mara did 4 things. The first was to work with Veth San to rebuild the medical assessment. They worked long hours in the laboratory. The young Cathari researcher and the human captain who had become an experiment neither of them had planned for, translating what had happened in Mara's body into language the Accord's full medical committee would accept. What a human immune system did with alien biochemistry was not contamination, not instability, not risk. It was the most sophisticated adaptive immune response any recorded biology had ever generated. The structure was familiar, the human body encountering a challenge and building something to meet it. The scale was simply extraordinary. They argued about framing. Vethsan wanted precision, Mara wanted clarity. They found a language that was both. Honest science presented with the understanding that science would be read by politicians who had already decided what they wanted it to say, and that the only defense against that was to make the truth undeniable. The second thing she did was establish contact with the 6 surviving Epsilon subjects. They were scattered across 3 systems in various shapes. 2 still in military service, 1 in academic research, 1 managing a civilian shipping operation on a frontier station, 1 whose current location was deliberately vague, and Rhea herself. They were different people with different lives. What they had in common, a serum, a body that had adapted, and years of deciding alone how to carry that fact. What they did not have in common, and what Mara noticed immediately, was what they'd done with what the serum had given them. The ex-military subjects had sharpened toward combat and threat assessment. The researcher had developed sensory processing that went beyond any recorded human capability. She could detect specific rare elements by their chemical signature from 30 meters away in a mixed atmospheric environment. The shipping operator had a navigational 6th sense. He could feel a ship's drive systems, the way another person felt their own heartbeat, predicting maintenance failures 3 days before they manifested. The one with the vague location had abilities she wasn't ready to disclose fully, but the brief, controlled hint she offered in their first secure transmission suggested her nervous system had found something at the outer edge of the electromagnetic spectrum that human instruments couldn't map. They had each become a different kind of extraordinary. The serum had given each of them a scaffold. Their own nature had built whatever fit on it. The third thing Mara did was transmit a full, unencrypted report to Earth Command. Not just the incident, but everything. The 11 precedents, the Epsilon series, the reclassification statute, all of it laid out in the flat, precise language of military intelligence. Admiral Vasquez replied in 6 hours with a message that was, for Vasquez, almost emotional in its directness. Second Fleet is moving to Accord proximity. Not in, not yet, but we're close, hold the line. And then she messaged a secondary channel. Not Vasquez, not official Earth Command, but the captains of the 12 ships at the frontier edge. Individuals she knew. People who had been sitting in minimum idle for months, watching and waiting and doing the math. She sent them one line: be ready, not for war, for anything else. The fourth thing Mara did was find John Set 2 weeks before the review, in the observation deck where she had spent her own first post-serum nights. He was alone, which was unusual for a delegate of his rank. He was looking at the star field, the way people look at something they have been looking at long enough that they have stopped seeing it. You know what's interesting about that view? She said, settling into a chair across the deck. He turned slowly, did not seem surprised she was there. There are an estimated 2 trillion stars in the observable universe, she continued, and Earth produced a species that looked up at them and thought, we should go there. Not because there was a survival advantage, not because a calculation said the odds were favorable, because we looked up and thought we should. She watched the star field with him for a moment. 4 million years of evolution, and that's still us, looking up and going anyway. You've been trying to plan for that. I understand why, but I don't think it's plannable. John Set was quiet for a long time. The Epsilon project, he said finally, was not malicious. I know, she said. I don't think you're malicious. I think you're old and good at management, and you met something you couldn't manage, and it frightened you. She looked at him. But I need you to understand that the thing that frightened you, it's not an anomaly. It's not an accident. What happened to me is happening to every human being who's been living in alien environments for the past 60 years. Slower, less dramatic, but it's happening. We adapt. We always adapt. And the question you need to answer is whether that's a threat you need to contain or a capability you want beside you. John Set's manipulators moved slowly, the Cathari equivalent of a long exhale. The review is going to show exactly what Vethsan and I built it to show, Mara said. The truth. But I'm offering you something better than a failed motion. I'm offering you an actual conversation about what humanity is and what we can do, and what we need from this accord. Not a management problem, a partnership, a pause. We are never going to be easy. I can't promise you that, but we are extraordinarily good at the hard parts. The Species Capability Review convened on schedule. Dr. Vethsan presented his findings to the Full Accord Medical Committee. 17 species, specialists from each, and he was thorough and precise, and he did not editorialize. The data spoke entirely for itself. What a human body did with alien biochemistry was not contamination, not instability, not risk. It was an adaptive immune architecture of a scope and flexibility unparalleled in recorded biology. The medical committee's formal finding took 6 hours of deliberation. The reclassification motion died before it was filed. But that was not the day the galaxy changed. The day the galaxy changed came 7 months later, when the first contact signal arrived from Sector 12, a region that, under the Frontier Pacification Protocol, would have been exclusively Cathari patrol territory. The signal was from a vessel of unknown origin, not in any database, moving with the intentional, unpredictable pattern of intelligence navigating unfamiliar space. Something new arriving at the galaxy's known edges and testing what it found. Commander Salik Idris aboard the human frigate ESS Steadfast recognized it immediately. He recognized it because he had spent 6 months in training scenarios, because he'd read every Accord First Contact Protocol document, and because, he would say later, with the half-law of a man who doesn't entirely believe his own luck. He'd once had a long conversation with a diplomat named Voss about the difference between a threat you manage and a capability you want beside you. He responded not with a defensive posture but with an open frequency. He offered his ship's translation matrix to whatever was out there. He waited. The response came in 47 minutes. A pattern. Not language yet, but the structural skeleton of something that wanted to be language. The beginning of a conversation. The Cathari command vessel in the adjacent sector held for 12 minutes before transmitting back. Continue. Confirm contact parameters. We are en route. Not we will handle this, not stand by while we assess. Continue. Mara was on Vithara Prime when the contact report came in. She was standing in the debating chamber explaining human children's learning methodology to a gallery of 43 Accord delegates. Her personal communicator vibrated once. She glanced at the coded header. Sector 12, first contact confirmed, Idris. She let the vibration settle into her palm. Felt the low electrical hum still running through her fingertips, steady and present. She did not interrupt her presentation. She finished, explaining the specific way a human child, placed in an unfamiliar environment, will spend its first minutes touching everything, cataloging by physical sensation, building a map through direct engagement with the unknown. And the chamber was quiet when she finished, the particular quiet of an audience that has been handed something to think about. Then she said, I've just received word that the ESS Steadfast, on Frontier Patrol in Sector 12, has made confirmed first contact with a previously unknown species. Our crew is engaged in preliminary communication. A pause. I wanted you all to be here when we heard about it. The chamber held its breath. Then the Tessari spokesperson clicked 3 times enthusiasm. Then the Vrendi made a sound that translated as remarkable. Then the rest of the chamber came alive in 17 different modes of reaction. And John Set, in his metabolic cradle, went very still for a long moment before his manipulators moved in a slow, deliberate pattern she had seen before. Agreement. The first contact species were given the name Vel Anari by the linguists who cracked their communication pattern, an approximation of the sound made when addressing large groups, something between a chord and a pressure wave. They were old enough to have watched 3 civilizations rise and fall in their stellar neighborhood. They had been watching the Accord's edge for decades before they decided to approach. They had not approached the Cathari vessels. When Resonance, the Velinari first contact coordinator, was asked why, the translated response took 4 hours to fully decode. The gist. The Cathari vessel was very still. It held position like something that had decided where it was and did not expect to be surprised. The human vessel was different. It moved like a vessel that expected to be surprised and had decided that was all right. They wanted to talk to the species that moved like that. The full Velinari contact negotiation took 2 years. Mara led the human delegation for most of it, with John Set's team as co-coordinators, the first genuine Cathari-human joint diplomatic operation in Accord history, which both parties found simultaneously difficult and valuable, which was approximately the right way for it to be. In the third session of the second year, during the informal conversational texture between formal sessions, Resonance asked Mara a question. They asked it in the mode the Velinari used for information they genuinely wanted. "What happened to your species?" they asked. "That made you like this?" Mara thought about how to answer. She thought about 4 million years on a world that was trying constantly and inventively to kill them. Temperature extremes, disease, predators, drought, ice, the specific grinding relentlessness of a planet that had no interest in survival and enormous interest in their demise. She thought about fire and tools, and the decision to go beyond the horizon not because it was safe, but because the horizon was there. She thought about Rhea in the cargo bay with her mechanical arm and her years of going quiet, and the choice to stop. She thought about a tiny bead of liquid hitting a table and rolling into the wrong hand. What happened to us, she thought, is everything. Everything the universe could throw at a small, soft species with a big nervous system and an unreasonable amount of stubbornness, and we took all of it and built something out of it every time. And the thing we built was more capable of taking the next thing. What she said to Resonance was simpler. "We come from a hard place," she said, "and we got used to it." Resonance processed this for several minutes. Then they made the pressure wave sound the translation team had tagged as understood. 22 years after the accident on Vathara Prime, there was a plaque installed in the debating chamber, not in the human delegations section. At the center of the chamber, where presenting speakers stood, in the open space that belonged to no species specifically and all species collectively, it was a small plaque, understated, which Mara had insisted on. The inscription was in 14 working languages of the Accord plus Velinari harmonic script, and it read, in each language approximately the same thing. In this chamber it was decided that the capacity to adapt was not a risk to be managed. It was the beginning of a better question. Mara was 61 when they installed it. Same cropped hair, more gray. Same scar. Same biometric implant, long since fully incorporated. Park was there, Assistant Director Park now. Horak and Chen were both retired, and both there anyway. Rhea was there, with 3 of the other Epsilon survivors. Veth San was there, deep blue with authority and age, watching with the total registration attention of a scientist who had spent 2 decades rethinking things he thought he knew. John Set was not there. He had passed 3 years before, at an age Mara had simply accepted without trying to translate into any human frame. He had left one written communication addressed to her, transmitted on his death. She had received it in the early morning, sitting at her desk, with the star field in the window and the electrical hum still steady in her fingertips after all these years. It was 3 sentences. "The Accord will outlast both of us," it said. "I spent 400 years certain that management was wisdom. You taught me the difference." She stood at the plaque after the ceremony. The chamber had emptied. The atmospheric processors hummed their steady hum. The light fell through the chamber's high translucent panels and made patterns on the floor she had walked across 1,000 times. She put her hand on the plaque, felt the metal under her palm, the hum in her fingers. The particular clarity that the serum had given her senses, still there after 27 years, the body's memory of having been asked to learn something new and having answered yes. She had an answer she hadn't given Resonance, because it hadn't been the right time, because it was hard to translate, because it was the kind of answer that needed years before it was true enough to say. She said it now, in the empty chamber, to no one and to everyone. "We practiced," she said, "for a very long time on a very hard world. And when the universe finally let us out, we were ready." The atmospheric processors hummed. The star field held its 2 trillion fires. The plaque was warm under her hand. Somewhere in Sector 12, a human crew and a Velinari delegation were navigating a nebula no species had yet crossed, moving like a vessel that expected to be surprised and had decided that was all right. She stood there a long time before she turned and walked out. But the galaxy does not give you 22 years of quiet. Not if you've earned a reputation. Mara learned that lesson the hard way at 41, during the 18 months the Accord later listed in its formal records as the Teshari Severance Crisis, which was a bureaucratic name for something that came much closer to being the last war humanity would ever fight. It started, as things in the Accord always started, with a vote she wasn't supposed to understand the significance of, a routine recalibration of patrol sector boundaries. Nothing that triggered any of the 17 procedural alarms she had developed over her first years on Vathara Prime. She voted in favor, along with most of the chamber, and went back to her desk. The Tessari withdrew from the Accord 4 days later. There were 16 Tessari warships at that moment stationed in the transition zones between Accord territory and the contested deep frontier, the spaces that weren't anyone's yet, where every spacefaring species had economic interests and historical tensions, and approximately zero formal legal framework. The Tessari withdrawal made those ships free agents. It also removed the 3 Tessari delegations that had been, quietly and consistently, the swing votes that kept the Cathari from assembling the chamber majority they needed to pass any number of things that Mara had been keeping one hand on the wall to stop. She had 3 hours before the chamber convened an emergency session to recognize the withdrawal and begin the administrative transfer process. She spent 2 of them with Chen, who had come out of 6 months of semi-retirement, because this was the kind of crisis that made retirement feel like a hobby. They had one working theory. The vote that had triggered the withdrawal had not been routine. Someone had changed the sector boundaries in a way that was technically legal, procedurally invisible, and geographically disastrous. Specifically, by drawing the new patrol lines so that 3 Tessari colony systems suddenly sat on the wrong side of the Accord's formal defense perimeter, outside the protection zone, in the space where the Accord did not technically have an obligation to respond to a threat. Chen ran the numbers. The geometric shift in the patrol lines, completely invisible if you were looking at administrative sector codes rather than actual spatial coordinates, left those 3 colonies exposed. 3 colonies with a combined population of 400 million Tessari, in a transition zone where an aggressive push from any of a dozen unaffiliated species would have previously triggered Accord treaty obligations. Now it would trigger nothing. Someone did this deliberately, Chen said. He was 58 years old and had stopped being surprised by things about 12 years ago, but his voice had a quality she hadn't heard in a long time. Someone changed the coordinates knowing it would push those colonies outside the defense perimeter, and they ran it through a routine procedural vote because they knew nobody would be looking at the spatial geometry, just the sector codes. The Tessari noticed, Mara said. The Tessari noticed, and they had 2 choices. Formally protest and trigger a 6-month arbitration process during which their colonies remain unprotected, or withdraw and deal with the problem themselves using their own ships. They chose the direct option. They always choose the direct option. This was accurate. The Tessari were, in the Accord's diplomatic shorthand, extremely direct. They were crystalline, not metaphorically, literally crystalline. Their biology built around silicate lattice structures that grew and adapted over centuries like living geology, which gave them a quality of patience in governance that their directness in conflict sometimes obscured. When the Tessari decided a problem needed to be resolved physically rather than procedurally, they moved the way a crystal fracture moves, suddenly, precisely, in exactly one direction. 16 warships in the transition zones were currently pointing in exactly one direction. Mara spent her 3rd hour not in the chamber but on a secured frequency to Admiral Vasquez and the commanders of the human frontier fleet. She laid out what she and Chen had found. She gave them the spatial analysis. She gave them the timeline. Then she said, "I need to know what we can put at those 3 colony systems in the next 48 hours. Vasquez was quiet for a moment. "Those systems are outside our patrol jurisdiction." "They are," Mara agreed, "but they're not outside our field of vision. And the Tessari are not our enemies. Whoever changed those sector codes is the problem here, and whatever they're trying to accomplish, it involves either getting the Tessari to shoot at someone or getting someone to shoot at the Tessari while the Accord looks the other way." Another silence, longer. "I need 12 hours to legally justify a presence in that zone," Vasquez said. "You have 6. Make it work." She ended the transmission and went to the emergency session. The chamber was already at chaos level 2 when she arrived. The kind of organized, procedurally correct chaos that happens when 17 species each have different instincts about what constitutes an emergency and different response timings. The Vrendi were filing objections. The Cathari delegation was very still, which she had learned to read as either calm deliberation or the particular stillness of people who are watching something they expected happen and are now managing their reaction. She couldn't yet tell which. She requested the floor and was denied twice before Horak. Working through back-channel procedural contacts she hadn't known he still had active after 6 months of retirement, got her a 30-second window. 30 seconds was enough. "Before we formalize the Tessari withdrawal," she said, "I want to put on record that the sector boundary adjustment passed in routine session 4 days ago, contained a spatial error. Not an administrative error, a spatial error. 3 Tessari colony systems that were within the Accord's formal defense perimeter yesterday are outside it today. I am formally requesting a geometric audit of the boundary coordinates before we take any further action. The chamber went very quiet. The Cathari delegation remained very still. She looked at Johnset. He met her registration with something she had not seen in him before in 7 years of reading his expressions. It was not guilt. It was not shock. It was something smaller and more complicated. Recognition. The look of someone who has realized that an error has been made that they cannot entirely account for by parties they cannot entirely name. That told her something important. It told her that Johnset had not known, which meant this had been done around him, inside the Cathari delegation structure, by someone with enough access and enough patience to insert a spatial modification into a routine vote without the delegate coordinator's knowledge, which meant the threat was not the Cathari. The Cathari were, in their ponderous 400-year-old way, as outmaneuvered as the Tessari. The threat was something smaller and faster and willing to start a war by adjusting a handful of coordinate values. The geometric audit took 9 hours. During those 9 hours, Vasquez got the legal justification he needed and positioned 3 human frigates. The ESS steadfast among them, Idris at the helm, at the transition zone boundary, visible on long-range sensors to the Tessari warships and to anyone else watching. Not inside the contested zone, at the edge, visible. The signal it sent was not ambiguous. You are not alone. The Tessari warships held their position. On the morning of the 10th hour, the audit results were presented to the full chamber. The spatial modification was confirmed. The origin point of the modification was traced, not quickly, not easily, through 4 layers of procedural misdirection, to a sub-delegation clearance code that had been granted to a non-Cathari agent operating under Accord administrative privileges. The agent was not in the chamber. The agent was not on Vethara Prime. The agent was. The Accord Security Division would determine over the following month. A Vrendi dissident faction that had spent 3 years building the access and patience required to insert one invisible change into one routine vote. Not the Cathari. The Vrendi. The species that had been abstaining from everything for 400 years. Waiting. Mara sat with that for a long time after it came out. The Vrendi had been watching the Accord's internal pressures, the Cathari-Haman tension, the Tessari's historical frustrations, the fragile equilibrium of species that had been managing each other's ambitions for centuries. And they had found the exact fulcrum point. They had not needed armies. They had not needed war. They had needed a coordinate change and a routine vote, and 17 species who trusted procedure enough that nobody was checking the geometry. The Vrendi faction was identified, their access was revoked, and the Accord entered the longest and most consequential internal reform process in its 400-year history. A complete audit of every procedural access pathway, every administrative code structure, every routine vote mechanism that had been running on trust and precedent without verification. It took 2 years. It was spectacularly unglamorous. It was also, Chen said one evening during the 3rd month of working through document archives, possibly more important than anything else they had ever done. We're rebuilding the foundations, he said, because we discovered the foundations had rooms in them that nobody had been in for a century. The Vrendi found those rooms, Mara said, and we should be grateful they did, in a way, Chen said, because someone eventually would have, and the next time might have actually started the war. He wasn't wrong. The Tessari returned to the Accord 18 months after their withdrawal, having confirmed the geometric restoration of their colony's defense perimeter through independent calculation, and then through a process that the Tessari called resonance verification, in which multiple crystalline beings simultaneously confirm a spatial truth by individually triangulating from different orientations. The ceremonial session to formalize their return was the most attended in the chamber's history. The Tessari spokesperson, delivering their ratification address, paused midway through and said, in a specific direction that was not the Cathari delegation and was not the human delegation's table, but was, precisely, where Mara was standing. We noted the ships at the boundary. We noted who put them there. The Accord is not what it was. We will invest in what it is becoming. The Vrendi abstained from the ratification vote, but the faction responsible had been removed, their access codes purged, and the abstention this time felt different. It felt, for the first time in anyone's living memory, temporary. The years accumulated the way years do when you are doing work that matters. Not quickly, not with the dramatic accelerations of crisis and near catastrophe, but with the steady, unglamorous accumulation of things decided, things repaired, things built. Mara led 3 more major negotiations, lost 1 vote she thought she should have won and won 2 she expected to lose. She went back to Earth twice in 7 years, which was less than she should have and more than she managed to feel at home. The planet was still there, still hard and wet and enormous, still doing its 4 million-year project of producing organisms that didn't know when to stop adapting. She stood in a field outside her sister's house in what used to be Wales and felt the rain and felt her enhanced senses map the biochemical complexity of that rain, the specific isotope ratios of water that had been in the Atlantic, the particulate history of a cloud system that had crossed from North America, the faint electromagnetic hum of the town's power grid 8 kilometers away, and she thought about Veth San's words, "Your cells do something our instruments translate as learning." This was what Earth had always been building. Not soldiers, though it had built those. Not diplomats, though it had made those as well. It had been building things that learned, things that took the hardness of the world and turned it into a more sophisticated relationship with hardness. Not immunity to difficulty, but a fluency with it. A capacity to arrive in a difficult environment and begin, immediately and involuntarily, reading it. She went back to Vethara Prime and did her job. The electrical hum stayed in her fingertips through all of it. Through the Velinari negotiations and the Tessari severance and the 2 years of procedural reform and 3 more crises she would rather not think about in detail. Through the promotions and the elections and the slow, grinding, occasionally infuriating work of persuading 17 species that humanity was not a problem to be solved, but a presence to be accounted for. The hum was just there, steady and low, as natural now as a heartbeat, as natural as breathing. As natural as the habit she'd never broken of humming tunelessly when she thought, or the scar on her left temple that she'd stopped explaining because the story had gotten long enough that it deserved more time than most people were prepared to give it. And then there was the day, 12 years after the Velinari first contact, 3 years before the plaque was installed, that she sat in a medical bay again. Different bay, different station, different Cathari physician, but the same quality of institutional quiet that medical bays everywhere generate, as if illness and recovery operate at a frequency that filters out unnecessary sound. She was there for a routine biometric assessment, standard Accord health monitoring for modified personnel, now a formal protocol that she had helped write and that covered, because the precedent existed and the Accord had a use for precedents. The 6 Epsilon survivors who had come out of Shadow, and the additional 11 humans who had, in the years since Vethara Prime, undergone documented partial adaptations to alien biology through environmental exposure. Not the dramatic acute response she had experienced. The slow version, the everyday version. People who had been living in alien gravity wells and alien atmospheric compositions for decades and whose bodies had, quietly and without drama, been learning. The physician this time was a young Tessari, genuinely young, by Tessari standards, perhaps 60 years old, their crystalline structure still translucent with the clarity of early growth. The physician had been assigned to the Accord's new multi-species biological adaptation research division, which was one of the better things to come out of the reform process, and which had as its founding premise, visible in the statement of purpose, that Mara had reviewed and approved, the idea that adaptation was not an anomaly. It was a process. It was worth studying. It was worth, specifically, not being afraid of. The physician ran the assessment, everything routine, then paused. "I want to show you something," the physician said, in the careful, accented standard they had been learning for what they described as only 18 months. They turned the diagnostic display toward Mara. "This is your neural map from 7 years ago, a translucent diagram. This is your neural map from today." Mara looked. She was not a biologist, but she had been looking at her own scan data for 20 years and she understood the basics of what the colors and structures indicated. "It changed," she said. "It changed," the physician confirmed. "Not from the serum. The serum's integration completed years ago. This change is from," a pause, a very Tessari pause, the crystalline equivalent of choosing words precisely, "from use, from living in this environment for 20 years, from the work you have been doing. The neural architecture associated with multi-species communication, conflict resolution, and threat pattern recognition has developed structures that," another pause, We do not have precedent for it in any biology. We have precedent for its function. We see it in very old Cathari and very old Tessoari, the wisdom architecture we call it, informally. The structure that builds up in a being who has spent centuries thinking about large systems. I've been thinking about large systems for 20 years, Mara said, not centuries. Yes, the physician said. In Cathari, this takes 200 years. In Tessari, 150. In you, a look at the scans back to her. 17 years from the first Accord session where you demonstrated strategic multivariable assessment to this scan. Mara was quiet for a moment. My species does things fast, she said. Your species, the physician said carefully, does things at a rate we do not have good language for. It is not fast. Fast implies the process is the same, just accelerated. What your biology does is, it finds shortcuts through learning that our longer-lived species access through duration. You are not doing the same thing faster. You are doing something different that arrives at the same place. A pause. This is very interesting to us. And also the word in standard is unsettling, not dangerous, not threatening. Unsettling in the way that a new understanding of a familiar thing is unsettling. You have to rearrange what you thought you knew. Mara thought of John said, of his 3-sentence letter. I spent 400 years certain that management was wisdom. You taught me the difference. I know that feeling, she said. She walked out of the medical bay and back into the corridor and stood for a moment with her hand flat on the wall, feeling the station's systems through her palm, the hum in her fingers, the 2 trillion stars outside the hull, 4 million years on a hard world, then 60 years in the galaxy, adapting in real time, not because the Accord had sanctioned it, not because the Cathari had planned for it, because that was what human bodies did with a new environment. They moved in, felt the walls, listened to the pipes, and started learning the language. She thought of the first contact question. What happened to your species that made you like this? She thought of a better answer than the one she'd given. Not a simpler answer, a more honest one. We fell. She thought it clearly, standing in the corridor with the station's hum under her palm. We fell off every cliff the universe built for us. And then we climbed back up, every time, and we were stronger at the places that broke. And we went back to the edge and we fell again. And we were stronger again. 4 million years of falling and climbing and falling. And when the galaxy finally found us, we had been climbing so long that we had started to look like something new. Something the universe hadn't made before. Something it was still making. She hummed tunelessly and walked back to work. The war, when it finally came from a direction nobody had planned for. Not the Cathari, not the Vrendi dissidents, not the Tessari or the dozen other species whose tensions the Accord had been quietly managing for 4 centuries. It came from outside, from the dark between the mapped lanes, from something that had been watching the Accord's internal arguments for years and had drawn the correct conclusion. A house that argues with itself is a house that leaves its doors unwatched. They had no name in the Accord databases. The first human to encounter them, on the outer edge of Sector 9 aboard the exploration vessel ESS Cassini Point, called them the Tide because the first sensor reading her ship got was a mass of objects moving through the transition zone in a formation pattern that looked, on the thermal display, like a wavefront coming in from deep ocean. There were 47 ships, then 63, then 111. The ESS Cassini Point had a crew of 8 and no weapons beyond point defense. Her captain, a woman named Yuko Haruda, who had been on her 2nd exploration contract and had not signed up for this particular education, sent a contact burst on every open frequency, and then made a choice that would later be the subject of 3 separate academic papers, and 1 rather good novel. She did not retreat. She held position, turned on every sensor suite she had, and started building a data packet. 14 minutes of full spectrum recording, drive signatures, hull composition analysis from the EM return, formation geometry, behavioral patterns, the specific way they moved relative to each other when they adjusted course. 14 minutes of her crew at every instrument station, building the most comprehensive picture of an unknown hostile force that had ever been assembled from a single unarmed ship in sensor range. Then she burned hard for the nearest Accord beacon and transmitted everything. The data packet reached Mara's personal implant the same hour it reached Earth Command and Accord Central. She was in a briefing session. The new Accord security protocol was called the Integrated Frontier Assessment, one of the reform-era structures she was most proud of, and it met weekly and included species representation from 9 Accord members, which would have been unthinkable 6 years earlier. She read the packet header and stood up. "I need the room," she said. The room understood. She read it through twice, standing alone in the cleared briefing space with the display on full projection around her. The tide's approach vector rendered in 3 dimensions. The drive signature analysis flagging readings that didn't match anything in the known database. Ancient tech was her first read. Not primitive, ancient. The difference, which she had learned to feel over years of dealing with the Cathari, was that primitive technology was simple and inefficient, and ancient technology was often exquisitely efficient in ways that younger species didn't immediately recognize because they were looking for complexity and finding elegance instead. The tide's ships were fast, not Cathari fast. Humans were faster there, which had been one of the things the Cathari had never quite adjusted to, but with an endurance that the drive signature analysis suggested was extraordinary, as if they were optimized not for speed but for duration, for crossing very, very large distances at a sustainable pace and arriving with full operational capacity. They had come a long way. She messaged Vasquez. She messaged Idris, who was 3 sectors over with a small patrol group. She messaged the 6 people in the Accord security briefing she'd just cleared from the room, because the protocol she'd helped design specifically required multi-species assessment for contact events, and she had no intention of bypassing it, even now. Then she drafted an Accord emergency session request, flagged Priority 1, and sent it through every formal and informal channel she had built over 17 years. The emergency session convened in 4 hours. That was a record. The previous record had been 7 hours, set during the Tessari severance crisis. Mara had long believed that one of the unremarked contributions of that crisis to the Accord was that it had given the chamber practice at moving fast when it needed to. Practice was not nothing. In humans it built reflex. In the Accord, apparently, it built something analogous. She stood at the center of the chamber and presented Haruta's data packet. The chamber was very quiet. The Cathari delegation was very still. The Teshari spokesperson was showing resonance indicators in the crystalline lattice of their upper body, the equivalent of a significant emotional response, the crystalline patterns catching the light differently. Mara let the display run. The full 14 minutes of Haruta's recording projected into the chamber's 3-dimensional display space, the tide's ships moving in their wavefront formation, ancient and fast, and coming from a direction that put them squarely in the approaches to 3 of the Accord's most populated frontier systems. "I want to be clear about what we know," she said when it finished. "We know they are numerous, they are fast, and they are moving toward us. We do not know if they have attempted contact through channels we haven't monitored. We do not know their intentions. We do not know their history. We know only what an 8-person exploration crew recorded in 14 minutes under significant duress." She paused. "And we know that the exploration crew in question, rather than running, stayed and built us the best possible picture of what we're facing." She looked around the chamber. 17 species, the product of 4 centuries of argument and compromise and the kind of slow, accreted trust that only got built by surviving crises together. "I'm not going to stand here and tell you I know what the right response is," she said. "I'm going to tell you that I know what the wrong response is. The wrong response is 17 species making 17 separate decisions based on 17 separate threat assessments. We tried that before this Accord existed. It didn't work." A pause. "We have spent the last 6 years rebuilding the foundations of this body. We built them specifically for this. For the moment when something arrives from outside that our existing frameworks don't account for. This is that moment, and I genuinely believe that the Accord we have now, after everything, is capable of meeting it." The Cathari delegation's manipulators moved. The agreement pattern she had learned 17 years ago, Johnset, was gone. His successor, a Cathari named Velshan, who had been observing Mara for 3 years with what she had come to recognize as a combination of scholarly fascination and professional respect, spoke for the Cathari delegation. "We defer to the Integrated Frontier Assessment Protocol," Velshan said, "entirely. The Accord responds as one." The Tessari spokesperson clicked once, a sound that in their species meant, "It is decided." The Vrendi abstained, but when the formal vote on an integrated response posture was called, the Vrendi's seat holder, for the first time in 400 years of Accord sessions, raised the indicator for yes. One of Mara's staff, watching from the gallery, made a small, involuntary sound that she recognized from 17 years ago, in a session that felt like a different universe. She did not let herself react, but she felt it. the hum in her fingertips going a little steadier, a little warmer, as if her adapted biology had its own way of registering something that mattered. What followed was 49 days of the hardest collective work the Accord had ever attempted. Not a war council, not yet. Nobody used that word, because nobody wanted to be the one who started a war by describing a situation as one. What they called it was a contact preparedness assessment, which was accurate but considerably less dramatic than what it actually was. 17 species, unprecedented integration, and a human captain with an unusual immune system running a coordinated response to an unknown threat while simultaneously trying to determine whether the threat was actually a threat. Haruta's data became the foundation of everything. The Velinari, who had come to trust Mara and through her, had come to trust the Accord enough to share navigational records going back 800 years, identified the tide's drive signature in their oldest archives. Not enemies exactly. Something more complicated. A nomadic civilization that had been moving through the deep frontier for centuries, staying outside settled space, occasionally touching its edges. The Velinari had made contact with them twice in 400 years. Both times the tide had communicated and then continued moving. Both times the communication had been cautious, limited, and concerned primarily with territory, specifically, with whether they were being followed and whether this space belonged to someone. They were not conquerors. They were refugees. Something had been pushing them for centuries, and they had been moving away from it, and the space they were moving into was, from their perspective, unmapped frontier. They did not know the Accord existed. They did not know that the systems in their current approach vector had populations, numbering in the billions. They had been crossing empty space for so long that they had stopped expecting to find anyone in it. When this became clear, when the Velinari translation team, working with the Accord's newly integrated multi-species linguistics division and a human xenolinguist named Dr. Park, Don Park, retired communications officer, who had turned out to be exactly as good at languages as Mara had suspected 17 years ago, cracked the first layer of the tide's communication structure. The chamber session that received the news was the quietest Mara had ever been in. Not the quiet of tension, the quiet of something being unexpectedly true. She was the one who drafted the first formal contact message to the tide. She worked with Velinari harmonic templates, Teshari spatial truth protocols, and the particular kind of clarity that came from 17 years of learning how to say things that were honest in a way that 17 different biologies could receive without distortion. The message was simple. We are here. This space belongs to many now. We did not know you were coming. We would like to know who you are. We are listening. The tide received it on the 42nd day. They held position for 6 days. 6 days of Accord uncertainty. The kind of uncertainty that Mara had learned to stay physically present for rather than monitoring from a distance, because physical presence had a stabilizing effect on people that no amount of data transmission could replace. And there were 17 species of people in this building who needed something to be stable right now. She spent those 6 days in the chamber or adjacent to it. She slept 4 hours a night in the duty quarters off the main corridor, the same ones she'd used during the Tessari severance. She ate at her desk. She talked to people, all kinds of people, the junior delegates who were having their first serious crisis, the senior ones who were having their 100th, and were handling it with the particular exhaustion of people who'd hoped they were past this. She talked to Velshan, who had questions about human decision-making under uncertainty that she answered honestly. She talked to Park, who was living in the linguistics division at this point and subsisting on something he described as adequate nutrition that she was fairly sure was just coffee and determination. On the 7th day, the tide responded. The message took 3 days to fully decode. When it was done, when Park sat down with her in the linguistics division workroom with the translation rendered on the display and said, quietly, "I think you should see this." She read it through twice and then sat with it for a long time. The tide had a name for themselves that decoded, approximately, as those who carry the memory. They had left their home space 200 years ago. The thing pushing them was not a species and not a natural disaster. It was the collapse of their own civilization's environmental support systems, a slow, catastrophic, centuries-long failure of the stellar nursery their home systems depended on. They had been carrying their population in a fleet rather than on planets because there were no habitable planets between their origin point and wherever they were going. They had been carrying their culture in data archives, and in the practice of elders passing knowledge to children born on ships, and in the specific forms of their communication, which were built to survive the loss of infrastructure because they had been building them for infrastructure loss for 200 years. They had been carrying the memory of a place that no longer existed, and they had been doing it long enough that the carrying itself had become the identity. They wanted to know if there was room. Mara read it twice, felt the hum in her fingertips, felt the scar on her temple, felt the 4 million years that had produced her, and every other human being who had ever looked at an impossible situation and thought, there has to be a way through this. She drafted the response herself. She ran it through every diplomatic review process she had: Velinari resonance check, Tessari spatial verification, Cathari precedent analysis, and 4 other verification steps that had not existed 6 years ago, and existed now because the Accord had rebuilt its foundations and discovered it had more room in them than it thought. The response in the end was 2 sentences. There is room. Come, and let us figure out together what that means. The tide entered Accord adjacent space on a Tuesday, Accord standard calendar, which didn't mean anything to them, which would mean something to them eventually. And the 17 species of the Galactic Accord were at their instruments and in their communication stations and, in Mara's case, standing at the observation deck of Vithara Prime with her hand flat on the wall, feeling the electromagnetic hum of an approach that was different from anything the station had registered in its 300 years of operation. Not threatening, not tentative. Something in between, something that felt, if you were a human with 17 years of experience reading situations and an unusual immune system, and 4 million years of accumulated stubbornness running through your blood, like something coming home to a place it had never been but recognized anyway. She pressed her palm flat on the observation window. Glass and starfield, 2 trillion fires in the dark. She hummed, tunelessly, the way she always did when she was thinking. The tide's first ship cleared the sensor boundary, then the second, then the fleet. All of them, 172 vessels, moving in the wavefront formation that Haruda had recorded with such precise care 14 weeks ago. Every drive signature she had cataloged now live and real and present, coming into the light. Mara had thought, 17 years ago, that her job was to hold the line. She had been right. But she had not known then what the line was. She had thought it was a line between humanity and the galaxy, between safety and exposure, between the small, fragile species near the atmospheric processors and the 400-year-old civilization that thought it knew what things were and wasn't going to change its assessment without cause. She knew now. The line was not between humanity and the galaxy. The line was what you held in yourself, the conviction that the hard world that made you hadn't made you only for endurance, that the 4 million years of falling and climbing had built something worth offering, that when you walked into a room full of beings who had been certain about the shape of things for longer than your species had been using tools, and you sat down near the atmospheric processors and waited, and you paid attention, that was not weakness. That was the thing. That was always the thing. She had a theory about the Accord, about what it actually was, underneath the procedural architecture and the formal records and the 400 years of managed consensus. She had developed it slowly, over 17 years of sitting in the chamber and watching what happened when crises hit and the procedures failed, and the species in the room had to fall back on something that wasn't written down anywhere. What they fell back on was, everyone looks at the human. Not because humans were the strongest or the oldest or the most sophisticated, because humans, at the moment of genuine unstructured uncertainty, the moment when there was no procedure and no precedent and the situation was simply new, were the only species in the room that visibly, physically, expressively did not require certainty in order to act. Every other spacefaring civilization in the Accord had achieved its maturity through the accumulation of certainty. They knew who they were. They knew their place in the structure. They moved with the authority of deep self-knowledge, which was real authority, genuinely earned. But self-knowledge, Mara had observed, had a habit of becoming a horizon beyond which you stopped looking. You knew where you were and you stayed there, efficiently, optimally, in the same place. Humans did not know where they were. Humans, on a fundamental biological level, were built to keep finding out. Every new environment, new challenge, new chemical, new crisis, the human nervous system's first response was not defense, not retreat, not optimization. It was mapping. It was the same thing a human child did in an unfamiliar room. Touch everything, Catalog by sensation, build the picture. That was what an immune system that learned instead of merely reacted was built for. That was why, when the unknown arrived, 17 species of the most sophisticated civilization structure in the known galaxy looked at the small species near the atmospheric processors. Because the small species near the atmospheric processors had been practicing for this. 4 million years, one hard world, and the door was open. She was still at the observation window when Park came and stood beside her. He was gray-haired now, reading glasses folded in his breast pocket, the calm unchanged from the day she'd met him. Just deeper, she thought, not a calm born of not feeling things. A calm built from feeling everything and deciding to stand still in it. They stood side by side and watched the tide come in. "What do you think they're carrying?" he said. Not the logistics question, the other one. She thought about it. "Everything that matters," she said, "same as everyone else." The first tide ship crossed the threshold into the Accord's formal welcome zone and the station's greeting systems, which the reform process had finally updated to include contact protocols for scenarios exactly like this one, activated their light-based signaling array. A low, warm pulse of amber gold light that moved across the exterior of Vithara Prime in a slow wave, the Accord's signal for welcome, adapted over 3 years of multi-species input to be as recognizable as possible to as many biologies as possible. The Tide's lead ship answered. Their signal was a sound transmitted on a radio frequency, complex, layered, the same structure that made their language feel like music when the linguistics team processed it. It was not the language yet. It was just the sound. The way you might hum something before you have the words. Mara felt it through the hull, through her palm on the window, through the hum in her fingertips that had been there for 20 years and would be there for the rest of her life. Steady and low, the serum's permanent signature, her body's permanent answer to the question it had been asked unexpectedly on an ordinary morning in a diplomatic chamber near the atmospheric processors. The question had been, "What will you do with this?" And the answer, every day for 20 years, had been the same. "More than you expected." She lowered her hand from the window. She straightened her collar. She turned away from the starfield and walked back to work. There were 17 species waiting for her, and 172 ships full of people who had been carrying their memory for 200 years and deserved to put it down somewhere, and an Accord that had spent the last 6 years rebuilding its foundations and was ready, for the first time in its 400-year history, to genuinely mean it when it said the door was open. She hummed as she walked. The corridor was warm under her feet. The stars were behind her. The work was ahead.